If I asked you what the oldest Christian writings are, you'd probably say the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They come first in the New Testament. They tell the story of Jesus, so they must be the oldest, right? Wrong. The oldest Christian writings weren't written by people who walked with Jesus. They were written by a man who never met him, and they're not stories at all. They're letters, personal correspondence, and they changed everything. The Apostle Paul wrote letters to churches across the Mediterranean world starting around 50 CE, a full 20 years before the earliest gospel was written. These weren't theological treatises. They were responses to real problems in real communities, arguments about food, questions about marriage, conflicts about leadership. Paul dashed them off to address immediate crises. He had no idea they'd become scripture. 1 Thessalonians, written around 50 CE, is likely the oldest Christian document we have. Compare that to Mark's Gospel, written around 70 CE after Jerusalem's temple was destroyed. Matthew and Luke came later in the 80s. John's Gospel, the 90s. The New Testament's order is theological, not chronological. The Gospels come first because they tell Jesus' story, but Paul was writing decades before anyone thought to write that story down. His letters capture Christianity in its earliest, rawest form. So how did personal letters become scripture? Start with the mechanics. No printing press existed. Everything was copied by hand. When Paul sent a letter to Corinth, someone in that church, often a trained slave working as a scribe, would copy it. The church might keep the original and send copies to neighboring communities, or they'd send the original along and keep a copy for themselves. This is how texts spread in the ancient world, one handwritten copy at a time. We have direct evidence of this exchange. Colossians chapter 4, verse 16 instructs, "After this letter has been read to you, see that it is also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you, in turn, read the letter from Laodicea." Churches were explicitly told to swap letters. Paul's words weren't meant to stay in one place. They were designed to circulate, and some letters were designed from the start to travel even further. Take Ephesians. In the earliest manuscripts, something strange appears. The greeting reads, "To the saints who are in," and then a blank space. Later, manuscripts fill in Ephesus. But the oldest copies leave it empty. And this wasn't a mistake, it was intentional. Ephesians was a circular letter, a template designed for multiple churches. Each congregation could insert their own city name, one letter, many destinations, the ancient world's version of a mass mailing. Here's where it gets more complex. Paul's influence grew so enormous that disciples continued writing in his name after his death. Pseudepigraphy, writing under a teacher's name, was a recognized ancient practice. It honored the teacher and extended their legacy. Colossians was likely written by a disciple, possibly after Paul died. Ephesians was written by a different disciple who used both genuine Paul and Colossians as source material. We can trace the literary DNA. Phrases from authentic Paul appear in Colossians. Those same phrases plus new material from Colossians appear in Ephesians. This wasn't forgery in the modern sense. Ancient readers understood that students wrote in their teachers' names. The content mattered more than the byline. These disciples weren't trying to deceive. They were trying to apply Paul's thinking to new situations he never faced. They asked, what would Paul say about this problem? And they answered in his voice. The practice shows just how authoritative Paul had become. His name carried weight. His words demanded attention. The key question, when did personal correspondence become Holy Scripture? We can watch this transition happen in real time. 2 Peter, itself a pseudonymous letter written around 100 to 150 CE, contains a remarkable passage. It refers to Paul's letters and says people distort them as they do the other scriptures. This is the only place in the entire New Testament where the word scripture refers to Christian writings rather than Jewish texts. Right? We're witnessing the New Testament being born. Paul's letters have crossed the threshold from correspondence to canon. Canon, the official collection of scriptures, didn't fall from the sky. It was assembled over centuries through a messy human process. Paul's letters show every stage: writing, copying, circulating, imitating, and finally canonizing. First, Paul writes to address immediate problems, then churches copy and share his letters, disciples imitate his style and write in his name. Eventually, later Christians recognize these texts as authoritative scripture. The New Testament is the product of this long, complex evolution. When you read Paul's letters, you're reading the earliest Christian voice we possess. These aren't abstract theological essays. They're urgent responses to real communities facing real conflicts. Should Gentile converts follow Jewish law? How should the church handle sexual immorality? What happens to believers who die before Christ returns? Paul tackles these questions in real time, improvising theology as he goes. You're watching Christianity figure itself out decades before anyone wrote down the stories of Jesus. The next time you open the New Testament and skip past Romans to get to the Gospels, remember, you're skipping the oldest material to get to the newer stuff. Paul's letters aren't a prelude to the main event. Chronologically, they are the main event. Christianity's first written words.